Have you ever enjoyed a beer? Well, whether you have or have not, you've probably noticed that much of the beer enjoyed in America today is brewed in the Midwest. Now, while there's many questions which can derive from that observation, one of them is the historical question. And that question is this: if we were to take the clock and turn it back to a time before Midwestern beer dominated the country, before our parents' generation or even our grandparents' generation, to around the middle of the 19th century, which state would we find had the most amount of breweries and which city contained the largest brewery in the country? Records from the time period actually provide us with the ability to answer both those questions. But before I provide you with them, and if you don't yet know where I'm going with this, I'd like to invite you to pause the video now and guess, perhaps comment, which city you would have guessed contained the country's largest brewery by size around this time period. Okay, you got your guesses? I'm reading straight from a book published during the time period when I say, quote, "At the present time, the largest brewery in the United States is that of John Taylor's Sons of Albany." You see, around the middle of the 19th century, whereas New York State had the most, Albany itself contained the largest brewery in the entire country. So why exactly is this? What are the reasons that can explain Albany's ascendancy within America's brewing industry during the first half of the 19th century? In other words, between 1800 to 1850. That question is exactly what this video is all about, and by the end, you'll know the answer. So in order to best deconstruct the answer, what I've done is compartmentalized it by looking at three main components: geography, demographics, and technology. Each of them have their own unique elements, and we'll dive into the details of each, but to get us started, for now, we'll look at geography. First of all, if we just take a look at where Albany is located, it sits on the banks of the Hudson River and just south of the mouth of the Mohawk River. And if you've ever lived in the American Northeast, you'll know that it rains a lot over there, and that rain has to go somewhere. Fortunately for all those living in upstate New York, the entirety of the capital region is encompassed by the greater Hudson River watershed. And what that watershed does is it takes excess runoff water from upstate New York down south via the Hudson River and all the way to New York City, past Manhattan, where it flows into the Atlantic. So what this means is that if we look at the climate, precipitation rate, and topography of New York State's capital region, we'll notice that it produces an environment that is naturally capable of supporting an ample amount of moist, arable land. Because of this, Albany is left with no need for any large-scale artificial irrigation or drainage infrastructure to prop up the already fertile soil. As a consequence, all these realities intricate to the capital region's landscape made the area surrounding Albany conducive not only to general agricultural prosperity, but specifically to the cultivation of barley, which is the principal grain included in Western-style beer. And the importance of that ingredient really can't be overstated. Producing beer at scale requires a whole lot of barley. In fact, here's a map that should help demonstrate the dominance which Albany enjoyed in the cultivation of barley around the time period. Now, that was part one of geography. The second part of geography I'd like to look at is the Hudson River itself. You see, if you want to move material like resources or people on land, it's very costly, but if you can float them, it's incredibly more efficient and way cheaper. The Hudson River acted not just as a watershed which carried excess runoff southward, but in fact much like an economic thoroughfare, taking material and people from New York City's metropolitan area, which at the time housed the biggest portion of the country's population, all the way to upstate New York. With its facilitation of travel and trade, the river made moving people and products between Albany and New York much easier. So that's part two of geography. Now, the third part of geography is more general. If we look at the national geopolitical landscape in North America around the middle of the 19th century, we'll notice that in large part the French and Spanish have greatly diminished in their influence on the continent. The only major power that retains a large presence is the British, and yet even they didn't have a lot of their people living in North America in the 19th century. Due to this shift in European presence on the continent, we can see that Albany enjoyed a relative insulation from European competition. If European breweries that had existed for hundreds of years with customer loyalty and contracts wanted to compete with Albany brewers for American consumers, they would have had to ship their resources from Europe all the way to North America across an entire ocean. This endeavor would have seriously increased transportation costs and costs of the product, which therefore gave Albany the advantage in this instance. So now that we've looked at all things geography, let's turn our attention to the demographics and see who got the ball rolling in Albany. Initially, it was the Dutch in the 17th century, which is important for our analysis since the Dutch are no strangers to brewing beer. They'd been doing it for hundreds of years prior, and in fact, drinking beer has been a staple of Dutch culture going back to at least the 14th century. Now, after the Dutch came the English, similarly, a people that are not shy about brewing beer. Matter of fact, if you look up treaties to see how beer was brewed back in the 19th century, you'll find a plethora of English literature on the topic, which is very helpful if you're trying to make a video on said topic. Now, eventually the Redcoats, the English, were of course kicked out, and in its place you now had a new federal government in North America. One of the things this led to, of the many, were new waves of immigration to the continent, specifically German and Irish people. This is important because the first person to ever set up a brewing institution in the United States, that is a school meant to teach people how to brew, was actually a German. So the Germans were an overall net positive to the country's brewing industry. Secondly, we have the Irish. Now the Irish were, let's just say, notorious in Europe for their willingness to accept their working wages in pints. So they no doubt provided a good customer base in the country of people who wanted alcohol. So those were the populations behind the demographic factor. Now let's also take a look at the policies. In the early American Republic, right after the Revolution, a lot of the laws passed by the federal government were rather protectionist in their nature when they concerned trade. This meant that if you were in America and wanted to brew beer, you needed to get your barley domestically because to import it would have been cost prohibitive since there was a tax on that. Therefore, whoever in America had access to the most barley would naturally brew the most beer. And as I referenced earlier in the factors on geography, Albany had a lot of barley, which in turn gave it the advantage in that respect as well. So those are the demographic factors. Now we'll look at the role technology played. In the summer of 1807, Robert Fulton launched the world's first ever commercially successful steamboat. And do you know what river he launched it in? The Hudson. In the 19th century, steamboats started to become a staple of river transportation, making trade between Albany and New York City via the Hudson now much faster and much more reliable. After this innovation came another, the Erie Canal. Construction started in 1817 and was completed in 1825. What this artificial waterway did was stretch from Albany all the way to Buffalo and connect upstate New York, moreover America's East Coast, to its Midwest. Now, if you were from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or DC, and you wanted to get to America's interior without having to sail all the way around Florida, well, that meant you had to pass through Albany. As for the last technological innovation we'll look at, America laid 25,000 miles of it in a single generation. That's right, railroads. By 1860, they had changed the name of the game. Instead of just being constrained to the Hudson River or Erie Canal, Albany's people and products now had more access to transportation than ever before. Now, putting all the information we've gone over so far together, what does all this tell us? Well, what we can deduce is that the story of Albany's rise to prominence in America's brewing industry during the first half of the 19th century is partly a geographic phenomenon. Albany's land gave it barley, the Hudson River gave it trade access, and an entire ocean stood between Albany's brewers and their would-be European competition. It's also partly a demographic phenomenon. The Dutch, English, Germans, and Irish certainly didn't diminish the country's nor Albany's propensity to brew. Instead, if anything, they empowered it. Lastly, it's partly a technological phenomenon. Steamboats gave rise to faster and more reliable means of navigating rivers. The Erie Canal placed Albany as the first step on the road to America's newly acquired Great Lakes territories, and railroads transformed the landscape in ways never seen before. The geography, demographics, and technology which made Albany's brewing industry are as fundamental to it as they are to understanding the city's history. Put simply, if you're looking to understand why a certain city or place is so prominent, look to its geography, the where, its demography, the who, and its technology, the how. Thank you for watching. Hey, if you like this video or if it gave you a new perspective on beer in America, consider subscribing. My channel here is new and I'm just starting out, so I appreciate each and every one of you who watches my content and chooses to follow. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.